The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities that they represent. This program is intended for educational purposes. You're listening to
आप सुन रहे हैं
You're listening to
നിങ്ങൾ കേൾക്കുന്നത്
ನೀವು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ
Radio Azim Premji
ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ
Ghalib is a timeless poet, I think all of us would agree, but he's also very much a man of his times. So today we're going to look at Ghalib's times, his friends, his enemies, what were people saying about him, what was he saying to them about his poetry, and so on. In the Doordarshan TV show by Gulzar on Mirza Ghalib, which we have talked about earlier, there is a very funny scene, a mushaira scene. A mushaira is a gathering of poets where they read each other's poetry. And in this tradition, there's something called Misra uthana. A Misra is a line of a couplet, one line. And the tradition is that you recite that line and people recite it back to you to show that they're engaged with what you are reciting. That's called Misra uthana. And the funny bit there is where Ghalib is in the mushaira and Bahadur Shah Zafar, the emperor, is of course presiding over it, and all the famous poets of Ghalib's time, Ibrahim Zauq, Momin Khan Momin, they're all in the audience, or they're all participating in the mushaira. And Ghalib recites one of his poems. Kav kave sakht jani hai tanhai na pooch. Okay, I bet you didn't get anything out of that, except maybe some of you got tanhai. And then there's silence after that. So Ghalib says,
मिसरा उठाइए हजरत।
हमसे तो उठता नहीं, बहुत भारी है, तो कुली बुलवा लीजिए।
So what you saw, in case you missed some of that exchange, is the witty person quips, बहुत भारी है, नहीं उठता है, and the other guy says, कुली बुलवा लीजिए, right? Call the porter if you can't lift it yourself. Obviously, all the while directly suggesting that this is incomprehensible poetry.
Yu hota to kya hota? The World of Ghalib with Amit Basole. Episode 4, Friends and Enemies.
What is this poem, by the way? And why is it so difficult? This is what we are going to look at today. And we are going to look at Ghalib's world through his poetry. We're going to look at his friends. We're going to look at his enemies. We're going to look at his patrons. We're going to look at his disciples. And paint a picture of the man living among his compatriots. Kav kave sakht jani hai tanhai na pooch. Subh karna sham ka hai lana juwe sheer ka. Now let me translate it and perhaps explain a little bit. The first line refers to the digging. Kav is sort of an onomatopoeic word of digging through something. Digging through the tough life of solitude and loneliness. Sakht jani is tough life. Digging through the tough life of solitude and loneliness. Don't ask about it. Na pooch. Why not? How difficult is this lonely life? To make evening of the morning, subha karna sham ka. What is it like? It's like bringing forth a river of milk. Subha karna sham ka hai lana juwe sheer ka. Now I'm sure even after translating you're still scratching your head thinking, what river of milk? What is all this? Right? Now here's where the difficulty comes in. Of course, the words themselves were difficult, but the allusion is to a famous story of Shirin and Farhad. This is a Persian folk tale. Some of you may have heard about this, of the star-crossed lovers. Something like Layla Majnun, but except in Iran. Right? Farhad is the lover, Shirin is the beloved. And Farhad, by trade, a person who digs or excavates mountains. And the story is that Shireen is married to the king of Iran, Khusro. And Khusro knows that Farhad loves Shireen. So Khusro plays a trick on Farhad and says, oh, all right, you love her, do you? All right, you are very good with your axe and you dig through the mountain and so forth. You know what? Shireen could be yours if you just bring out a river of milk from the mountain for her bath. That's all. It's a simple task. Dig, bring out some milk. Of course, Farhad is not going to succeed in this endeavor. It's an impossible endeavor to bring a milk river out of a mountain. And that is the reference here. How difficult is it to make evening of morning? As difficult as Farhad would have found to bring the river of milk from the mountain. Now you can see, he's packed in all of these references and allusions. He's not the only one who does this, but he does a lot. So there's a well-known set of 4 lines which are supposed to be about Ghalib, or they don't reference Ghalib directly, but this is a poet, Aish Dehlvi, who was a contemporary of Ghalib, who wrote these lines. And the general feeling is that they were written in response to how difficult to understand Ghalib's poems was. And the lines go something like this. अगर अपना कहा तुम आप ही समझे तो क्या समझे, मज़ा कहने का जब है कि एक कहे और दूसरा समझे. If you only understood what you said yourself, then what is the point of it? The pleasure of speaking is when one speaks and the other understands. अगर अपना कहा तुम आप ही समझे तो क्या समझे, मज़ा कहने का जब है कि एक कहे और दूसरा समझे, कलामे मीर समझे और ज़बाने मिर्ज़ा समझे. He's referring to 2 poets who are Ghalib's predecessors, Mir Taqi Mir and Mirza Muhammad Rafi Sauda, both big Urdu poets. So he's saying, कलामे मीर समझे और ज़बाने मिर्ज़ा समझे, मगर उनका कहा ये आप समझें या खुदा समझे. But whoever this person is, whether he understands it or God understands it. There's another, perhaps even funnier episode recounted by Ghalib's student, Altaf Hussain Hali, as an illustration of how people made fun of Ghalib's verse. And the story goes like this. There's the character in it called Maulvi Abdul Qadir Rampuri, okay, presumably from Rampur. And he's a jester or a clown by temperament. So he runs into Ghalib and he says, आपका एक शेर है वो मुझे समझ में नहीं आ रहा है, थोड़ा समझा दीजिए. Can you please explain this poem to me? And here are the lines. पहले तो रोगने गुल भैंस के अंडे से निकाल, पहले तो रोगने गुल भैंस के अंडे से निकाल, फिर दवा जितनी है कुल भैंस के अंडे से निकाल. First take the essence of the rose out of the egg of the buffalo. Then whatever other medicines are there, take them out of the egg of the buffalo. Ghalib is astonished. He says, what is this? This is far be it from me. This is not my verse. Of course, Maulana ji keeps up the joke and says, मैंने अभी दीवान में देखा है आपके, आप ही का है शेर. And he keeps it up. Finally, Ghalib realizes that what he's saying is that this may not be in your divan, but something that makes about as much sense is there in your divan. I like this a lot, this story, because this verse is just so funny. Of course, the word bhains itself is a very funny word in the Hindi language. And so those of you who are Hindi speakers would know of the n number of idioms that exist in Hindi which invoke the bhains. जिसकी लाठी उसकी भैंस, भैंस के आगे बीन बजाना, अकल बड़ी की भैंस, गई भैंस पानी में. There are endless ones. So there's a kind of certain power, rhetorical power to the bhains that is used here. Of course, needless to say, the verse itself is meaningless. And this meaningless bit is really where the allegation really hurt Ghalib. So he in fact has a couplet which is in response to many of these. He responded in many different ways. I'll give you 2 examples. There's one couplet that he has which goes, न सताइश की तमन्ना न सिले का परवा, न सताइश की तमन्ना न सिले का परवा, गर नहीं है मेरे अशार में मानी न सही. I am not looking for acclaim or admiration, nor do I want a reward. If there is no meaning in my verse, you say, so be it. Gar nahi hai mere ashar mein mani, na sahi. So he clearly was bothered by these allegations. Through these kinds of stories and the poem that I just read by Ghalib, one gets a sense of how Ghalib might have contended with something that every artist, and perhaps not only artists, but anybody who's trying to create something in the world has to deal with, which is how do people respond to it? How do you respond to their responses? You could either say, well, you just don't get it, you're not smart enough to get my stuff. Or you retreat into yourself and say, are they right? Maybe I'm not good. And you have all this self-doubt and moments of, where you lose the belief that you're actually doing something worthwhile. All of us deal with this. And here we are seeing Ghalib deal with that. Here is another example, another 4 lines where Ghalib is responding to his critics. मुश्किल है ज़बस कलाम मेरा ए दिल, सुन सुन के उसे सुखनवराने कामिल, आसान कहने की करते हैं फरमाइश. I will hold the last line because it's a punch. Let's hear the first 3 lines again. मुश्किल है ज़बस कलाम मेरा ए दिल. Oh, my heart, he's speaking to his heart. I agree that my poetry is difficult. सुन सुन के उसे सुखनवराने कामिल. Accomplished poets listen to it. And what do they say? आसान कहने की करते हैं फरमाइश. कि भाई जरा आसान चीज़ें कहो, ये क्या है? गोयम मुश्किल वगर ना गोयम मुश्किल. मुश्किल है ज़बस कलाम मेरा ए दिल, सुन सुन के उसे सुखनवराने कामिल, आसान कहने की करते हैं फरमाइश, गोयम मुश्किल वगर ना गोयम मुश्किल. This last line can be read in 2 ways. If I speak, it is difficult. It's difficult for me to compose and speak, but it's also difficult to not compose and speak. This actually is the writer's motto, if you think about it. Right? Most writers struggle with this. It's difficult to write, but if you don't write, it's even more difficult because there's something that you want to say, and if you don't say it, then it torments you, right? So, goyam mushkil, vagar no goyam mushkil. This is actually a Persian line, which he slipped into Urdu. But there's another interpretation to this also, which is a very witty one, which is that I speak difficult things or I compose difficult things. Otherwise, it's difficult for me to say things. I just cannot say it in any other way. That is what he's... so it all boils down to, what can I do? I can't help it. This is how I think.
Coming up on the other side of the break.
अरे मिर्जा साहब वो आ रहे हैं.
कौन आ रहे हैं भाई?
अरे उस्ताद ज़ौक़.
आतिशे गम में दिल भुना शायद, देर से बू कबाब की सी है.
हर एक बात पे कहते हो.
On January 12th of 1925, a very beautiful woman and her male companion are driving from Kemp's Corner to Malabar Hill when a red car intercepted them. Half a dozen men with pistols and knives came out of the car and began attacking the occupants. The woman was Mumtaz Begum. Babla, however, was not so lucky. He died of gunshot wounds before receiving medical help. And this murder was the start of a media circus and the undoing of Tukoji Rao Holkar, Yashwan's father. We will tell you the story of the 40 days preceding the independence. In those few days, decades happened. In those few days lies the untold story of the birth of the Republic of India.
The India Project with Josie Joseph. Out now. Only on Radio Azim Premji University.
despite the bravado that Ghalib seems to be communicating through these kinds of examples that we've seen, the criticisms seem to have stuck. They seem to have rankled him. And, how could it not? Imagine Ghalib on Insta or Twitter, and, he's got his latest hot take verse, and he's put it out there as a post. And here come all of these comments. What is this? This doesn't make any sense.
What are you trying to say? I don't get it. Is this guy for real?
I know you might have belief and confidence, but you're going to think a little bit about it, right? So it's something like that. And we know actually that he does seem to have internalized, let us say, some of these criticisms, because many years later, he's writing in a letter to one of his friends, Maulvi Abdul Razak Shakir. He constructs a narrative for himself of his own intellectual and poetic journey.
15 बरस की उम्र से 25 बरस की उम्र तक मज़ामीन ख़याली लिखा किया। 10 बरस में बड़ा दीवान जमा हो गया। आखिर जब तमीज़ आई तो इस दीवान को दूर किया। औराक़ यक कलम चाक किए। 10-15 शेर वास्ते नमूने के दीवाने हाल में रहने दिए।
And he says that, I started writing poetry at the age of 15. And until the age of 25, I wrote quite convoluted and difficult to understand verse. I was under the influence of Bedil, the famous Persian poet Abdul Qadir Bedil, who was originally from Patna and spent most of his life in Delhi.
क़िबला इब्तिदाई फ़िक्र व सुखन में बेदिल व असीर व शौकत के तर्ज पर रेख्ता लिखता था। चुनाचे एक गज़ल का मक्ता ये था, तर्ज बेदिल में रेख्ता लिखना असदुल्लाह खां क़यामत है।
Bedil was Ghalib's sort of intellectual guru, although of course long dead when Ghalib was writing. So Ghalib says, under the influence of Bedil, I wrote all of this complex verse until the age of 25, and then I got tamiz. मुझमें तमीज़ आ गई और मैंने उसको अलग रख दिया. And then I started writing something much more understandable. That's the story he tells in the letter. But we actually know now, many scholars have looked at his writing, his evolution as a poet, and that doesn't quite seem to be the case. Yes, it's true that his language became much more understandable. It became less Persianized. So it had a wider audience. But the themes he's talking about, at the young age of 16 or 17, continue with him all through his life. Those don't change. What does change, perhaps, is the accessibility of the language through which he's talking about those themes. Ghalib had a very famous, almost lifelong rivalry with Ibrahim Zauq, who was the court poet of Bahadur Shah Zafar. He was the emperor's ustad who taught the emperor poetry. And Ghalib, of course, thought that he was better than Zauq, not surprisingly. And there is a lot of lore about their rivalry. So the incident is that Ghalib is sitting by the roadside at a shop, and Zauq passes by in his palki.
अरे मिर्जा साहब वो आ रहे हैं।
कौन आ रहे हैं भाई?
अरे उस्ताद ज़ौक़ पालकी में आ रहे हैं।
And Ghalib, of course, can't resist himself, so he has to say something. Some tana he has to give to Zauq. So he says,
बना है शाह का मुसाहिब, फिरे है इतराता।
मुकर्रर मिर्जा मुकर्रर।
हुआ है शाह का मुसाहिब, फिरे है इतराता. This fellow is a friend of the king. See how he's strutting about. हुआ है शाह का मुसाहिब, फिरे है इतराता. And Zauq listens. He doesn't say anything, moves on.
चलो भाई। ये ज़ौक़ थे ना?
He goes to the Badshah and complains. देखो ये चाय की दुकान पे बैठता है, ऐसे मुझ पे ताने कसता है. What is this? This is not the way to behave. So, and he says it to the king as a next time in the mushaira, you challenge him. Say, why did you do this? So mushaira comes and everybody's sitting there and Badshah is like,
कुछ शोरा हजरात शायद हमारे उस्ताद शेख इब्राहिम ज़ौक़ से नाला हैं और सरे राह उन पर जुमले कसते हैं.
I've heard some people are making fun of our court poet. He's my ustad, Zauq. He's one of the best poets in India, one should not be making fun of him. So somebody present there says, no, how can this be? Nobody can make fun of Zauq. Zauq's crony, who was appointed to bring it up, says, Ghalib, he said this about the Ustad. So Badshah says, is that true, Ghalib? Did you say this about Zauq? And then comes the moment of the extempore nature. So Ghalib says,
मेरी नई गजल के मक्ते का मिसरा उला है.
Yes, I was just reciting my latest poem actually. And it's the last verse of my latest ghazal. And everybody knows that the last verse is about the poet themselves. So he says, अच्छा, तुम्हारी गजल का आखिरी शेर है, सुनाओ. So he says,
बना है शाह का मुसाहिब, फिरे है इतराता. बना है शाह का मुसाहिब, फिरे है इतराता. वगरना शहर में गालिब की आबरू क्या है?
So he's tacked on the second line, which says, otherwise what is Ghalib's respect? What is this? It's only that he's a friend of the king. Right? Otherwise Ghalib is nothing. So he rescues the whole thing by on the spot, that's the story, composing something which meter-wise fits in, and it's actually a legitimate poem. Right? And then the king says, oh, okay, that's what he was saying. And Zauq, of course, doesn't want to let it go. So he says, if the last verse is so beautiful, then the whole ghazal must be even more beautiful. Why don't you recite the ghazal for us? Now the challenge is to make up a whole poem, which doesn't exist. Right? And then Gulzar shows Ghalib reciting the poem.
हर एक बात पे
कहते हो तुम कि तू क्या है, तुम ही कहो कि ये अंदाज़े गुफ्तगू क्या है, and so forth. So it paints Ghalib as this, guy who can compose a ghazal on the spot. Right? Don't take this too literally. We don't know if any of this happened, but it illustrates something that the tradition values a lot, which is your ability to write, on the spot. I want to give you a sense of, what I'm talking about when I say this sort of newness and freshness contrast. Think of an idea that is very old, like love being compared to fire, right? The fire of love. Your eyes are glazing over and saying, yeah, I've heard it 100 times before. Right? Now, the challenge of the poets is to talk about that same old thing in a new way. So people feel like you've said something. Here, I'll give you 3 examples. One by Mir Taqi Mir, one by Ghalib, and one by Jigar Muradabadi, who is from the 20th century. So we're looking at one sher from the 1700s, one sher from the 1800s, and one sher from the 1900s, all talking about very similar ideas. So let me start with Mir's. आतिशे गम में दिल भुना शायद, आतिशे गम में दिल भुना शायद, देर से बू कबाब की सी है. The fire of sorrow in love, the sorrow of love, its fire has roasted my heart, I think. Because I'm smelling kebabs for a long time. देर से बू कबाब की सी है. ये कबाब की कहाँ से बू आ रही है? यहाँ तो कोई कबाब नहीं बना रहा है. ओह, ये तो मेरा दिल है जो आतिशे गम में जल रहा है. So he's being funny, and I thought I'd give you an example of, a very commonplace word like kebab being used in this poetry. Now here's Ghalib. Different, but I hope you'll recognize the similarities. इश्क पर जोर नहीं है ये वो आतिश गालिब. इश्क पर जोर नहीं है वो आतिश गालिब कि लगाए न लगे और बुझाए न बने. Ishq par zor nahi, such a famous phrase that it's become its own thing in a way. In that way, Ghalib actually is like a bit like Shakespeare. Things that he has said have become almost parts of our language. This is one such example. So, ishq par zor nahi, meaning there's nothing you can do about love. You can't control it. It's that fire, jo lagaye na lage. You can't deliberately start it. But once it's started, bujhaye na bane. You can't put it off. So neither can you control when it starts, nor can you control when it ends. Right? It's that kind of fire. So again, love and fire, but he's done something nice and new with it. Right? And you want to appreciate this verse too, even though again, it is talking about something so commonplace. Finally, let me give you Jigar. By the time Jigar is writing, people have been writing about fire and love for hundreds of years. So how is Jigar going to respond? Well, here's his verse. Many of you may have heard it. ये इश्क नहीं आसान, बस इतना समझ लीजिए. ये इश्क नहीं आसान, बस इतना समझ लीजिए, एक आग का दरिया है और डूब के जाना है. This love is not easy. Ghalib already told us that. Right? Just understand that it is a river of fire and you have to immerse yourself in it to have any chance of getting out on the other side. Right? This is that sort of old idea that you have to get lost to re-emerge. Right? खुसरो दरिया प्रेम का उल्टी बाकी धार, जो उभरा सो डूब गया, जो डूबा सो पार. Same idea, this time with Amir Khusro. Well, this episode has been about Ghalib's patrons, his rivals, his friends and enemies, and his students and disciples. And speaking of disciples, well, my students are also waiting for me. So, bye for now and see you next time.
That was episode 4, Friends and Enemies. On the next episode,
न था कुछ तो खुदा था, कुछ न होता तो खुदा होता, डुबोया मुझको होने ने, न होता मैं तो क्या होता.
you're listening to
आप सुन रहे हैं.
You're listening to
നിങ്ങൾ കേൾക്കുന്നത് ന്യൂ കേൾತಾ ഇದ್ದೀರಾ.
Radio
Radio Azim Range
University.